Good afternoon. Sorry for a few minute delay. There was some technical difficulties. All right. Welcome to the quarterfinals of the 2021 Regents Cup competition. This is an opportunity to engage in an Oxford-style debate on a topic related to free speech. The prompt the students will discuss today is, there are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum. I'm going to explain the phases of the debate and then introduce our judges. There are 3 rounds of this style debate. In the first round, you'll hear opening statements presented by one student from each team, the affirmative team and the negative team. In the second round, the teams will engage in cross-examinations. This is an opportunity for the students to answer questions from the moderator. In the final round, one member from each team will present closing arguments. At the conclusion of the debate, our judges, who have received training on how to score the Oxford debate, will complete the scores of the event. We will post the results of this round shortly, and you'll find them on the Regents Cup website. I'd like to introduce our judges. Kim Covington, Vice President, Community Initiatives, the Arizona Community Foundation. Seth Liebson, host of the Seth Liebson Show. Luann Leonard, former regent of the Arizona Board of Regents and the Executive Director of the Hope Education Endowment Fund. Diane Bench from the Western Design Center, and Robert Shibley, the Executive Director of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Thank you to all our judges today, and judges, remember, you should be objective and unbiased as you listen and score the round. Your score should reflect who you think made the better argument. Students, before we begin, please note I will give you a 1-minute hand signal. I'll raise my hand when the round is ready to wrap up, and then I will announce the end of the round. Do we have any questions?
Samantha, on the score sheet, what room are we in?
3.
Room 3?
Yes.
Thanks.
All righty. Will the affirmative team please begin their closing or opening argument?
All right. My partner and I stand here today affirming the following resolution that there are certain texts with offensive languages or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum. For starters, we feel it is important to define what constitutes as offensive languages or messages. For instance, should we have literature within our sphere of academia that is written in such a way that it uses racial slurs or dehumanizing language towards certain groups, these instances would be deemed as offensive languages or messages. Moreover, the resolution refers to banning these texts from the curriculum. In this instance, we believe curriculum should refer to a K-12 education system. If it is looked through a university setting, it is seen that most universities' students are 18 and over and making them consenting adults. Not to mention that university students are able to choose what courses they're enrolled in, as well as what texts are required for that course are listed prior to course enrollment. On the other hand, a K-12 education system forces students to take certain courses and read the required text regardless of personal preference, because if they don't, it'll lead to a negative impact on their overall grade within the course. Let me just start off by saying banning texts that use offensive languages and messages is not a new and controversial thing. Let's take a look into Southern academic literature. The book, address delivered by Ms. Mildred Lewis Rutherford, Historian General of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, was a common read for the typical Southern classroom. Let's take a look at an excerpt from this reading stating, and I quote, "Was the Negro happy under the institution of slavery? They were the happiest set of people on the face of the globe, free from care of thought or food, clothes, home, or religious privileges." Is it justified that these readings be a part of our curriculum? This is a dark side of America's past, and should we give way to the exploitation of the false and offensive languages that slaves were, and I quote, "the happiest people on the globe," is blatantly offensive to many individuals across the United States. Not to mention that this particular text is academically irrelevant and does not belong in a classroom. Should teachers want to instill a lesson about slavery in their curriculum, they can look to many other texts that talked about the quality of life in a slave in a truthful manner without being offensive to the ancestors of many that were put to work against their will. According to the Facing South organization, address delivered by Ms. Mildred Lewis Rutherford, Historian General of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, was banned from the school curriculum in many states, with North Carolina public schools stating that they purified the schools from any objectionable books. Now, taking into consideration a more recent example, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is a piece of literature that is currently being circulated across various schools' curriculum through the US. This novel has many excerpts that can be deemed as racist or offensive. For instance, throughout the novel, the derogatory names for African Americans are used countless times, not to mention that improper grammar was used to portray the speech etiquette by African Americans, as seen in this excerpt saying, and I quote, "My heart was broke because you was lost, and I didn't care no more what become of me or the rap." All of the previous quote being misspelled and grammatically incorrect. This piece of literature is blatantly racist to these individuals of African descent. It dehumanizes them while instilling throughout the novel an image of them as uneducated individuals. Now, I know many of you may see this and think, why should we ban this book? I read this book too in school, and none of these ideas have stuck with me since. So we're here to tell you that it's not this book and similar books to this one in their entirety that we believe should be banned. But instead, we would suggest that these versions of the books be banned and replaced with the versions of themselves that have these racial slurs replaced and censored and the grammatical issues within the speech of certain groups corrected. This would provide the same educational experience and educational value from the book without the dehumanizing and offensive language, as this clearly goes against our words of all men are created equal. Moreover, we can look to examples beyond racism. The Kite Runner is currently a book that is being circulated in our K-12 academia, even here in Arizona throughout the Tempe Union High School District. Throughout this piece of literature, there are multiple instances of rape and sexual abuse. This allows for our students to be exposed to a very serious topic that should not belong in a classroom environment. Not to mention that The Kite Runner is a piece of literature that is meant to tell the story of an Afghanistani immigrant and his journey to our great nation, given the conflict that tore apart his home country. I say this because these sexual assault instances are not relevant to the story in the author that the author is trying to tell whatsoever. Meaning that should they be removed, as Isabel and I suggest, it would not hinder the integrity of the book or shift the story in any way. We would also like to address the topic of the school's right to choose what's in their curriculum. Here in the United States, most schools districts can choose how they select their books, and according to the LA Times, most books are selected by a board made up of teachers and board members. We want to respect and keep the autonomy schools have when it comes to the selection of the reading materials, so we would suggest that they do so in accordance to their student handbook. This is a booklet that the school uses to enforce their student code. It outlines the behavior that is acceptable in a learning environment, among other things like what speech is allowed in a classroom. Should we look to the standards that most schools put forth on their students, we could see that the examples I have listed above that are currently circulating in a K-12 academia as we speak violate many of the student conduct codes. This being said, we would suggest that the schools move forward with their selection of the books in accordance to the same standards that they hold their students of their educational institution too. If a student would get in trouble for using racial slurs or inappropriate language, then why should the literature in the same classroom of that student hold those very same racial slurs and inappropriate language that is explicitly prohibited from the students using? We would like to end with one final thought. Our schools across the country are the pillars of education for many Americans. We should not settle for the literature containing racial slurs and other offensive language within our academia, as we can do so much better for our students. Instilling books that are educational without offensive language would be educationally beneficial to our students, as they would be able to learn about the same topics without being exposed to offensive language, without any individual choice as to whether or not they feel comfortable reading such a book. This is not meant to shelter or censor our students from these sorts of texts, but is meant to instill a less offensive environment in a school where the sole purpose is to educate our students within academia, not offensive languages. Thank you.
Team, you may begin.
All right, just make sure everyone can hear me okay. Okay, perfect. Marnie and I want to thank the judges and our opponents for being here today and letting us debate a topic that is specifically relevant today outside of this debate. We are proud to negate their resolution. There are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from the library or in a curriculum. To help understand the debate, we'd like to provide some definitions. The definition of offensive is anything that causes someone to feel deeply hurt, upset, or angry. Already noting that this definition is extremely subjective, those who would be banning said offensive books now have to depict what that deeply hurt entails. The legal definition of offensive language is the offense of using language in a way which would cause such offense to a reasonable person in, near, or within hearing or view of a public place or school. Messaging and literature are defined as underlying themes or ideas. Although opponents may use offensive and obscene interchangeably, these are also not the same definition, as obscene texts are already banned. In the Supreme Court case, Island Tree School District v. Pico, they agreed on a plurality opinion. The PICO standard set that school officials may not ban books simply because they dislike the ideals. However, books may be banned if deemed inappropriate for children relating to sexually explicit content that is unsuitable for any group. It's important to note that 33% of challenges to ban books are brought by patrons and 32% by parents, only 10% by teachers, and 3% by students. These patrons and parents have control over their own students, do not have the right to restrict literature from the entirety of the school. There's always an opt-out option available to specify controversial books without any infringement on their grade or the other rights of students, although our opponents seemed to make it seem like if you were not reading a book because it made you uncomfortable, that you would get an academic penalty. However, we want to make it very clear that that's just not true. The National Coalition Against Censorship explained even books and materials that some may find objectionable may have educational value, and that the decision about what to use in the classroom should be based on professional judgments and standards, not individual preferences. The same Supreme Court decision, Board of Education v. Pico, ended with Justice Brennan mentioning that removing books off library shelves violates the First Amendment rights of these students. In quote, local school boards may not remove books from school libraries simply because they dislike the ideas contained in those books. We argue that many objectionable books that depict wrongdoings or offensive language can be found in the history section of many libraries, adding a necessary educational benefit to what these students are already discussing in class as part of their curriculum. Though our opponents may argue that these students should not be exposed to such content, we would like to remind everyone of the world we're living in. It is in these books that we were first assigned as required readings for the education of classic literature and American history that are the most commonly challenged. These include the likes of The Great Gatsby, Catcher in the Rye, To Kill a Mockingbird, many of which have ended up on the Radcliffe Publishing Group's top 100 novels of the 20th century. It would be depriving these students of essential cultural and historical knowledge, as well as differing viewpoints to ban these books. Marnie and I understand that second grade students shouldn't be reading Great Gatsby. However, there's already administrative rules in place based on grade for books that can be checked out. We understand that it's a parent's responsibility to view the world around them and make decisions about what is and is not intellectually appropriate for their child. However, as discussed before, this especially holds no ground when deciding the curriculum for the masses. No curriculum is inciting offensive meanings. It is traditionally written as a plan of action to accomplish goals concerned with broad historical, philosophical, and social issues already deemed important to learn. This is done by both the federal constitution and states who control the districts and define the standards. Imposing information restraints on free people is far more dangerous than any ideas that may be expressed in that information. In fact, many curriculums require Fahrenheit 451 to be read, one of the most infamous banned books. The central theme of Fahrenheit 451 is the conflict between freedom of thought and censorship. It's a book that explores a dystopia where the masses have given up books and reading due to the dangerous curiosity and questioning that they encourage. What message is being sent to our youth if we're banning curriculum that explicitly denotes challenging banning free speech? Having this ability would remove accessibility to anyone of any age information about the atrocities humans have committed. Racism, prejudice, and sexism are all offensive acts that play important roles in the suffragette movement or the Civil Rights Act. This cause and effect will entangle our history with these offensive acts, disallowing our students to learn anything about their history that was not already deemed good and friendly. When first hearing this resolution, we understand that it might sound perfectly reasonable to have instances that books are banned, but in reality, none of these reasons are legitimate when basing them containing subjective offensive language or messaging. We understand how the affirmative may stress the danger of extremist books. However, there's already set regulations that extremist ideals do not fall under already. We want to emphasize that banning books is censorship, plain and simple. While the affirmative may argue that banning books is to make students feel more comfortable in the classroom, it's necessary, and we contend that ignoring hard-on conversations in schools does not make these topics go away. It's more beneficial to acknowledge potentially offensive media rather than ignoring it. Although allowing books in schools opens a door for productive learning experiences in a safe environment, rather than stifling any controversial discussions altogether. As our distinguished keynote speaker, Keith E. Whittington, states in his books, arguments and ideas that some might find hateful might as well be deeply flawed and widely rejected. But we gain most for good ideas, however, if we demonstrate why bad ideas are mistaken rather than treat them as taboo. Most banned books in general are banned because of a few words or concepts that some view as unfit for children, yet the central themes contained in these books have been a backbone to American education. Banning books due to potentially offensive words or messages opens the door to expressing what the youth can and cannot learn, which is especially dangerous in a society that promotes free speech. For these reasons, we urge you to vote in the negation. Thank you.
Affirmative team, could you answer what is your opinion, or can you explain how, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Affirmative team, can you respond to the concept that censorship won't make the damaging or offensive ideas go away?
We would. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, good. We would like to respond to this, that our resolution is not, well, the way that we are describing books that should be banned is based on sexually explicit and violent content and dehumanizing language. The overall themes of the books that we used as examples, particularly The Kite Runner, does contain sexual violence, which we are in favor of censoring or removing from the book. However, the overall story is one of an immigrant's journey and how they developed as a person. We know that these ideas will not go away. We understand and are deeply sympathetic to the negations arguments that we need to interact with these uncomfortable ideas, which is also why we think that the discussions over what should and should not be censored are particularly valuable. When we simply allow everything into it, there is no actual critical discussion. Most books that are proposed to be banned do not end up being banned, but there is a significant amount of conversation generated about them that allows us to critically engage with what the book means, with what ideas that our children need to know, and what ideas are academically rigorous. We think that the best response to, and this is something we do not take lightly, the banning of a particular book is not necessarily because of the ideas contained within it, but material that could be potentially traumatizing to children, which is part of the reason our proposals involve modified versions of the book so that children can gain the ideas contained within without needlessly dehumanizing potential members of the classroom or traumatizing them with sexually violent content.
Negative team, how would you respond to that?
So just as Isabel said, she said censoring an immigrant's journey. So my question would be, so who has the power and why to explicitly say that the truth behind their journey should not be shared because these ideas were uncomfortable? Also, to her point of protecting the safety of the students, that is all of our key, I think, argument here. However, there is no direct correlation between decreased GPA, decreased mental health, anything like that from reading these banned books or uncensored version of the books that they would like banned.
Affirmative team, you had indicated that grades could be impacted if we were not allowed to ban certain books. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, we can. This is in response to some of the alternative programming that is provided, including providing an alternative book for students to read that I believe the negation brought up as well. While this idea is very nice in theory, in practice, this has led to students sitting in the library for 3 weeks doing independent study, which basically amounted to a study hall. This is not an equitable education compared to what their peers were getting, and they should not have had to go through that. Instead, they should have been able to be in a classroom, interacting with their peers, and engaging in critical discussion.
Negative team, how would you respond?
Samantha, thank you for bringing up that you brought the difference between grades being impacted and the level of education maybe not being the same as their peers may be. A large argument that our opponents are making is that you can keep the standard of education while still censoring books, and you can have both at the same time. However, we would contend that censoring the true versions of the book, they're still going to provide the harsh and uncomfortable ideals behind it, even if you get rid of a few slurs. It's important for teachers to address that while the slurs may have been relevant at the time to use and they knew that they were dehumanizing, why we do not use them today rather than ignoring that they were ever used in the first place. It's not conducive to the same learning environment when we just ignore any bad or ugly language instead of having the conversation of why we no longer use that language. But it's important to have the original text available because, you know, the dehumanizing themes may still be in the text even if you are not using the even if you get rid of the slurs that are still there.
Affirmative team, can you respond?
Yes, I would like to respond. I think we need to clarify some of the parameters of our argument. We are not arguing for the complete removal of these books from every environment. We are simply removing them from the curriculum in their original form. They can still be in a library and a student can still pick them up and read them on their own. And we would also like to push back a little on the idea that teachers can't still address these topics. In fact, the censorship of this can actually lead to a very valuable discussion, particularly with how these discussions occur. It generally involves many different parties, including members of the community, administrators, and teachers, who discuss the themes of the book and who discuss its ability to be educationally informative and to be substantive and have artistic merit. And these generate more critical discussion about the book than it would if it was simply continuing to exist in its current form. It allows us to address, yes, we don't use it anymore, and we address why that original version of the book is being changed for this particular curriculum. One doesn't need to read some of the offensive language in, say, To Kill a Mockingbird to be able to get the underlying messages of how good people can get caught up in racist and classist systems, or why these systems were bad in the first place. Taking out certain instances of racial slurs, in, again, to use the example of To Kill a Mockingbird, does not negate Finch's ultimate argument in the trial that there needs to be justice done to those most marginalized in our society.
How would you respond to that?
Yeah, if it's all right, I would like to ask 3 clarifying questions to the affirmatives argument. So if you still know the slur is there and have to discuss it, then why is it being censored in the first place? And then so you're saying that the curriculum would be censored, however, the teachers can still discuss themes, then why not just incorporate that back into the curriculum? And my last clarifying question would be, how is that helping anyone when you are censoring and manipulating history into a much cleaner version than it is?
I think
Respond?
Isabel would probably be most suited to answer this question.
Thank you. Can you repeat your first question, please?
If you know the slur is already there and you are saying that it is good for the teachers to be discussing why it's not there, isn't that the exact same thing as just reading it and discussing why we don't say that anymore?
You bring up a good point, and I think that it is one that we do need to discuss. The main thing that, one, I want to emphasize, we do not want to expose marginalized students to dehumanizing language. And if we can still get the overall themes of the book, which, by the way, in all of the examples we provided, the instances where we would recommend censoring it do not impact the overall themes of the book, and therefore the book itself is still educationally valuable even with that censorship, except you aren't exposing students to dehumanizing language or sexual violence. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the second question? I just want to take this like point by point.
Yeah, actually, it was my mistake. The second question was pretty similar to the first one, so I'll
Okay.
skip to the third one.
Okay.
How is that helping anyone when history is being manipulated into a much cleaner version?
Well, the thing is, we're not actually trying to manipulate history here. We're trying to make a classroom environment that can facilitate this discussion without needlessly alienating certain students. history is uncomfortable, and we do all know that, and it's all very accessible to us. We aren't proposing that we go through the history section of the library and cover in Sharpie every objectionable thing that's happened in history, or we do acknowledge your point that there would be very little left in it. But we do also have the ability to address that without exposing people to dehumanizing language, and by presenting these alternative, like presenting these books in an educationally valuable format where all students continue to be able to participate.
Negative team, do you have a response?
I think I would like to respond by saying, clarifying that our opponents are saying that, you know, certain marginalized students shouldn't have to be subjected to dehumanizing language because that makes them uncomfortable and that's not conducive to a good learning environment. However, I would contend that if you're just trying to get certain dehumanizing language out, but these general themes are staying the same. One of the generalized themes is that historically marginalized communities were dehumanized. You know, how can the you know, themes be upheld if you're trying to censor and make things nice and clean if that wasn't historically relevant at the time? You can't censor specific words but then still have the general theme of communities being dehumanized at the same time, because at one point or another you're still allowing for the idea that there was dehumanization. And if you don't allow for that idea, then you are, you know, kind of censoring history and to make it something, you know, nice and clean and pretty instead of something that is uncomfortable, like you stated.
Can I respond briefly? Thank you. We agree and we are sensitive to the point that you bring up that this is still tidying up history, and we understand that this is a concern. But we would also like to point out that that's not the only part of our argument. Our primary example that we used was The Kite Runner, which contains sexual violence. And are teachers always able to confront sexual violence? And are they always aware of the students' experiences with this? Are they equipped for students who have had experience with sexual violence who then become traumatized by this content? We're trying to, in this, create a classroom where people are not alienated from it. And you're right. And maybe this particular form of censorship is not the best way to go about something in all cases. However, those are not the only cases that our argument is addressing.
Negative team, I'm sorry, Marty, did you have a response?
You're okay.
Negative team, how does parents' responsibility play into your negation?
So as Naya kind of was explaining, these banned books are not actually coming from the students' wishes, they're coming from the parents' wishes, which makes, I think, to speak a little bit on what Isabel was just saying, it does increase this almost insensitivity argument, because it's not the students that are wishing this, it's the parents to do their job, to do a parent's job and protect their students. However, if they are protecting their children in school from not being able to learn about possible things that happen during immigration, like sexual assault or Holocaust or things like that, then we can rightfully assume that they are also not discussing it at home, in which one parent's decision to not allow their student to learn all of this would in turn censor every other student, because it would be censoring the curriculum. So that's what we're trying to protect. And as Naya already mentioned, there are opt-out things that they can do that wouldn't decrease their grades.
Have a response, affirmative team?
So I want to touch up on the opting out option that you guys present. The alternatives to opting out, they're pretty bad. As Isabel mentioned, you have to be in a library environment, basically an independent study environment, for about 3 weeks, where you're kind of not able to express your ideas about the book that is being discussed in class. In that sense, your freedom of speech is being hindered because you're not able to discuss the book in class just because there is a barrier of this offensive language that is keeping you from that, that goes explicitly against the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974 that requires students of educational institutions to not have barriers that prohibit them from, and I quote, equal participation. You can choose this opt-out program, yes, but will it ensure that equal participation? It will not.
The team, can you respond?
So I think I want to address this first, as you are including that, you know, there are single people that are being singled out because their parents might not want them to be exposed to certain language. So I guess the alternative to that would be one parent deciding that as a whole, no student should be able to participate in certain topics that they find uncomfortable, which again, that's what we're saying. It's not a conducive learning environment to have one parent decide that nothing can be stated because that's what makes their child's education equal to everyone else's, because they don't want them to learn about, you know, specific topics that they find uncomfortable or they don't want their child learning about. We're also talking specifically about messaging as well, as the resolution states, that it's not just a single word, but it's messaging. And these messages are important to learn in the entire book or curriculum. So there's a difference between not learning the curriculum and not learning a book that has certain words that you don't like. So, you know, in our opt-out options, I'm pretty sure we mentioned that there would be alternative books, you know, not just someone being kicked out of a room for 3 weeks straight and having to learn on their own.
Affirmative team, do you have a response?
Yes, we do. We would like to address the argument that it is merely one parent who has the ability to bring a challenge and get a book unilaterally banned. This actually is not generally how the process of banning a book from school curriculum goes. And this process involves multiple parties, as we have mentioned, including teachers, administrators, parents, having a discussion about the academic merits of the book. It's not simply one parent deciding for a whole school based on what their expectations are for their child. It's having a critical discussion about the value that this book, in its form or at all, adds to students' education. And we actually believe that having these critical discussions about books and their values and the value of them in relation to students' education actually generates more critical speech about the book than it is simply available. It engages the community in a civil dialogue about what educational needs that the community's children have and what value this book may or may not add to that. It's not simply one parent deciding for a whole school, it's a community deciding what is best for itself.
If I may add on to that, I would also like to add that this is not a restriction of the reading of the book in and of itself completely. No, if a parent and a child feel that they're obligated or that they would, like, out of their own will, want to go and read the book, they can still do so. It'll still be in libraries. They can still purchase it from a private entity, but just within the school curriculum, we choose for it not to be instilled within the school curriculum. They can still go out and read it, just doesn't, like, it's not essential for the school curriculum.
Negative team, do you have a response?
I'm going to first comment on Isabel's. So as Naya said in the opening, there are legit statistics that do prove that it is not the teachers or students. That 33% of challenges to ban books are brought by patrons and 32% by parents, only 10% being by teachers and 3% by students. So we agree that the civil dialogue would be amazing, but that is not what's happening. And then also, as Juan was saying, they just want to ban it from curriculum. However, this resolution also goes ahead and says books in general. So that includes both public libraries and school libraries. So just kind of saying that you're not going to read it in schools, but you can go out and get it in a public library, that is almost null and void because this resolution is saying that it can be banned there. Also, how would you know of its presence if you're being censored from it from in school as a K through 12 student?
Can I have a brief response? Thank you. We'd like to clarify that the language of the resolution does in fact specify school curriculums. Earlier in the semester, the resolution language was changed from school curriculums and libraries to just school curriculums. And that is the premise of the resolution that we are operating on. And that is why in our argument, we are able to make this distinction between censoring in a curriculum versus censoring in general. We would also like to address that school is not the only place that students hear about literature. There are a wide variety of spaces where students are exposed to ideas and potential books to read. I know for me personally that many of the books that I have found most impactful are ones I read on my own, including from libraries or on recommendations from other people. You can still hear about a wide world of literature outside of a classroom, and it would be a shame to limit students' literature to just what is in the classroom and just what is discussed there.
Team, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I want to make a comment specifically on something that Isabel stated earlier, that when books are banned, it's communities making the best decision for what the other community members learn. And I just want to bring up that, you know, there are inherent biases. It would be great if, you know, school legislators who are making these decisions were inherently unbiased, but that's just not true. There is an example of the book George by Alex Gino being actually challenged and then banned in schools. It was an LGBT positive book, and it was banned after going through the exact process that you mentioned, because it was restricted for content that did not reflect the values of the community. So I would just like to emphasize that the process in place that Isabel says is very fair, and it's conducive to a good learning environment. Historically, these are biased panels, and that's not inherently fair to what the students may learn.
Affirmative team, how would the community biases impact your affirmation of the resolution?
We would describe the example that the negative team brings up as extremely unfortunate, and we find that that can be a regrettable outcome of the process. However, we also have to acknowledge that everyone has biases, that even what is decided if there are no restrictions on the curriculum will reflect the teacher's abilities and taste in literature. Simply pointing out that communities and people have biases is just pointing out something that is true of all people. Which is also why we defined what we believe should be censored in our argument very narrowly to dehumanizing and sexually violent language.
Negative team. If only the portions that are censored deal with the dehumanizing and sexualized violence, how will that impact the learning environment?
As Naya had stated earlier, this idea of only censoring the dehumanizing aspect of the story would equate to, in some cases, the entire story. For instance, during the Holocaust, all of these people were dehumanized, and that is part of the history and why it was so bad in the first place. And that's just one example. Most of our history does focus on these dehumanizing aspects. So I'm not sure if that's something we should be protecting our students from, because that is our history, and the only way to know anything about it is to learn from it. Simply censoring some aspects of it, I think in some cases it is wrong for us to tell the author of such stories that we are censoring this part of your story because it is not important for education, that your story doesn't equate to education because it is too problematic. So I think that when you do only choose to censor certain parts, you're leading down a road of, well, then who gets to censor those parts? Who defines what to censor? And is this going to be every school?
Affirmative team, can you respond?
So
Yeah.
as we mentioned, we very narrowly defined our definitions to dehumanizing language and instances of sexual assault. You can go through and throughout the history of the Holocaust and everything that went on in World War II without using dehumanizing language to describe the Jewish community. That is not, you don't need that dehumanizing language to describe what happened in the Holocaust. That's just not essential. So in Hitler's Mein Kampf, you can talk about what happened in the Holocaust and in Germany, but you don't have to use the racial slurs against Jewish people.
If I can just add something on. I would like to use two examples, The Diary of Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel's Night. The Diary of Anne Frank was actually edited by Otto Frank in order to release it in order to protect aspects of her privacy and his own. This is very similar to what we're introducing, actually. And we're still able to read The Diary of Anne Frank. I read it in school twice. We're still able to learn about the events of these traumatic historical events, including from the people who lived through them, which we acknowledge and agree with you is incredibly valuable to know, and that we need to know about these unpleasant aspects of history. Similarly, with Elie Wiesel's Night, it is a narrative from his point of view, and we are not suggesting removing that from school curriculum. We are simply suggesting that the words that were used against him are not valuable in discussions about all of the things that he went through. You can describe the experience of Elie Wiesel and you can read Night, but in discussing it, you don't need to use anti-Jewish slurs to describe him.
And negative team, can you provide a final response, please?
Yes, so sorry. I think it's important to note that sexually violent language or explicit slurs, when they're being used in material that's being read for curriculum, they're not just there for shock value, it's because they're relevant to the text and messages involved. If you're going to remove dehumanizing languages, but then contend that you're not remove dehumanizing messaging, then what is the point of getting rid of that language in the first place? And also, as you mentioned, with the censoring of The Diary of Anne Frank, there's a difference between that censoring being done by her father before it was published and being done by schools to, clean up the story. As Juan had noted in his opener, schools would have the direct authority to, kind of retype things to make them seem less dehumanizing so it would be more comfortable to read. However, we would like to really emphasize that can be completely changing the meaning of the text in general and just getting rid of a few words, but then keeping the dehumanizing messages in general. It doesn't really make sense to get rid of a few words if the general messages are still going to be there.
Thank you. And this concludes round 2. We're moving on to round 3, which will be closing statements. Each side will get 5 minutes to present their closing statement. I will raise my hand at the 4-minute mark. We begin with the affirmative team, please.
Thank you. And I would like to thank the negative team for a very valuable discussion about how to engage with difficult topics academically. I would like to start off by mentioning that we are sensitive to their concerns that history may be censored, which is part of the reason we have defined what should not be included in a school curriculum extremely narrowly, and have proposed ways to keep these books in the school curriculum with their themes and the ability for them to impart academic value. We also want to mention that in these cases that we have defined, we single out dehumanizing language and sexual violence, and we would like to ask, should we hope that administrators do the right thing and address these topics in a meaningful and sensitive way to the students, or should we engage in a larger conversation about how this book and its themes should be introduced into an academic environment? We are not anti-free speech, but we do have to realize that we do have to engage with a rather contradictory aspect of the process of banning books, which is that one person alone does not get a book banned from the curriculum. It requires a much longer process, and that, in fact, is why most challenges to books fail, is because you have to encounter multiple perspectives throughout the process in order for this to happen. There has to be, even if the teachers or administrators or students themselves are not the person bringing the challenge, the person bringing it still has to face their criticisms. They still have to face the members of the community who find this book to be academically valuable, and there still has to be a discussion about this. We actually think that this process counterintuitively generates more speech about the book than would be engaged if it was simply added to the school curriculum without critical interrogation. We would also like to make the distinction, as the resolution does, between curriculum and general availability. In removing certain books that contain dehumanizing language and sexual violence from curriculum, we are not removing them from circulation. And we are not denying any student's ability to seek out those books on their own. We simply do not think that it can be engaged with in the classroom in a manner that will not alienate students. We also want to address the PICO case that focuses on as the negative side addressed, the content of the book and not simply feelings about it, which is why we address specifically dehumanizing language and sexual violence. Those are aspects of content of the book. In the example we use of the kite runner, the sexual assault that takes place is objectively sexual assault. That is an aspect of content. And it is not even an aspect of content that damages the overall arc of the story. So simply removing it from the discussion does not rob students of academic rigor and allows teachers who may not be equipped to deal with and provide support for victims of trauma similar to the sexual assault discussed in the book. We also are sympathetic to the alternative proposals that the negation team offers, but we are skeptical of how they appear in practice. While an alternative reading assignment or an alternative environment might seem like a very good idea on paper, the way this has tended to play out is that students are denied the ability to have critical discussions in a classroom with their peers over the same book, and have been placed in the library for up to 3 weeks just studying and have lost educational value for it, even if they may not have lost a letter grade and still been compensated as equally participating. They were not getting an equal amount of education. We understand the concerns that censorship and banning of books is a slippery slope, and it is one that we seek to address in part by defining our argument very narrowly to what can be at least somewhat objectively measured, and is in order not to dehumanize students. We would also like to point out that one can always read a book later. One is not robbed of reading The Great Gatsby in the 10th grade if they can simply read it once they graduate high school. However, thank you.
All right, am I okay? I can't hear.
Negative team, will you begin, please?
Sorry, thank you. I would also like to begin by thanking both our opponents and judges for allowing us to speak on such an important matter. We are all here today with the sole purpose to protect our First Amendment rights in the best way possible, especially for this resolution, as I am sure we have all discussed such a topic throughout our educational careers. With that being said, Nye and I would like to stress the implications of stripping free speech away from any library user. As free speech is protected under the First Amendment, with numerous court cases being passed disallowing this ban, we question the legitimacy of the AF's argument eliciting a better understanding of federal rules in the Supreme Court to claim that anyone has the power to ban books from libraries based on subjective qualities such as offensive language and meanings could result in a retelling of history through an inaccurate lens. Our opponents heavily relied on the ideas that text should be rewritten and washed anew as to not include many and to not include any offensive language. As Juan stated, this is unnecessary for the land of the free. However, our history proves that this has not always been the case. Simply censoring books censors out the truth about our history, which would negatively impact the students' learning. Although the intent of the AF's argument to protect those who may be personally offended by such books, this is a hypothetical. As someone who outside of this debate was personally affected by things like the Holocaust, it is extremely important not to, for lack of better words, sugarcoat this piece of history. They continue to ask for the censorship of said history, saying that only sexual assault is dehumanizing, yet continue to say that the themes of the books are not, when much of our history is dehumanizing. I question that it may be rude to censor issues that people truly went through if they deemed that not important to history or curriculum. As Isabel brought up in her Diary of Anne Frank example, it was Otto himself who censored the book before it was published, relating to the fact that censorship can only be done by the author, for they are the only ones who can dictate what is important to their story and what is not. Our opponents also failed to provide a set system that would overarchingly define how the speech would be censored, where and then still being incorporated into the curriculum. Their question toward administrators to address such topics as sexual violence is not up to singular people. They mentioned a longer process. However, if you look at history of banned books, many include those against such things like the LGBTQ+ content, again denoting that banning books only attempts to hide communal information. Isabel noted flaws in the system they proposed and thinks this is better than censoring any potential triggering topics in hope of not triggering students. As our distinguished keynote speaker, Keithy Whittington, states in his book, we advance truth not by burning the books of the wicked, but by winning converts through the force of persuasion. As Naya discussed, we understand the argument that the AF is trying to make. However, it is a failed attempt to preserve the innocence and integrity of our children, instead forcing them into unwanted state of ignorance. We have now undoubtedly created an uncouth environment between patrons and education, leading to self-censorship, as too often teachers choose not to use certain books for fear that these texts will create controversies leading to confrontations with parents, the members of the wider community, or school administration. Book banning explicitly contradicts curriculum and standards, as the purpose of a school is to prepare students for real life, then grappling with works offering profound insights into the human condition and serve as models for students' own thinking and writing. Availability of these works and curriculum have done little more than provide increased civic behavior. There's absolutely no correlation with decreased GPA or violent crimes. You are more inclined to do good for a society because you are able to learn from both the fictional and accurate past. Inherently limiting and intentionally restricting knowledge stems from the elitist viewpoint created by the notion of, if we hide the truth, then it somehow stops being true. However, at time where your knowledge and ideals are partly being molded in the classroom, choosing to keep things like sexism, racism, and antisocial behavior hidden disables teachers the ability to problematize them. If these are already things that parents want hidden, it results in pure ignorance and inability to grow and develop along with society. I want to stress the ideals that those books most commonly banned are the ones that most accurately and honestly portray experiences of the past and present. By acknowledging these offensive issues, we are acknowledging those still dealing with them. Ignoring someone's possible reality will not make the reality somehow go away. In fact, banning the curriculum in books that teach about others' obscene realities is what isolates them for others, for this is proving to them how little their administration care about their history over controversies with parents. For all the above reasons, Naya and I are proud to negate the resolution.
I would like to thank the students for a really good debate. You guys did a great job, and I want to thank the judges for listening. And the judges will score it, and the results will be posted on the website. Thank you guys very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you to yourself. Also, good luck to you guys.
Yeah, good luck.
Yeah, have a wonderful day.
Yeah, good job, guys.